No matter how I wake up feeling within myself and within my frame of mind, however my mental health is doing, it doesn't change the fact that we're tethered.
Welcome to Permission Slips, a space for you to practice paying attention to your life with self-compassion and kindness, so you can experience the wholeness, purpose, and joy you were made for. I'm Jillian DeBritz, a life and leadership coach and a recovering perfectionist, learning alongside you how to give myself permission to be human. I am so excited to introduce you to today's guest, author Adriel Booker. Adriel, thank you for joining us all the way from South Australia. This is incredible. What a treat.
I'm really happy to be here with you today, Jillian. Thank you.
Yeah, it's such a joy. And I shared with you before we started recording that I just finished reading your latest book, Tethered to Hope, and may or may not have been weeping in a mess of tears on the couch just a few minutes before we started recording. So I'm feeling a little tender and raw as we come into this conversation, and actually just really grateful for the opportunity to hear your heart and the message that you wrote. So yeah, I want to read your bio so people know who you are, and then I'd love to hear you talk about the book and where it came from and a bit of that journey for you as a writer. So friends who have not yet met Adriel Booker, you need to know who she is. She is a writer, a speaker, and a curator who believes the best things in life happen while gathered around the table. She lives with her family among the gum trees and sea breezes of a small town in South Australia, where they own and operate a vintage cafe, guest house, and co-working studio for creatives. Adriel is the author of Grace Like Scarlet, writes at the Foundry on Substack, and can also be found on Instagram at Adriel Booker and adrielbooker.com. Adriel, I'm so happy to meet you. Thanks for making the time. We're in different days even across time zones here. I'm on the West Coast and you're in Australia. Can you talk a bit about the process that led to writing Tethered to Hope?
Of course, I can. I think the background to it is that I wrote my first book it released in 2018. It's called Grace Like Scarlet. It's about grieving with hope after miscarriage and loss. So my husband and I, we had two children, two sons born, and then we had a series of three miscarriages. We had another son and then another miscarriage. That was really my world for several years. Was the childbearing years for me were complicated, really complicated, beautiful. I had always wanted to be a mom, but they were fraught with a lot of loss and grief. And I wrote the first book, and that's its own story. But really, I wrote the book that I wanted to read when I was on the other side of it, because I had read several books in the genre, and I just couldn't find what was hitting it for me that
Yeah.
actually had theology, but was still really pastoral and approachable and had real practical grief support. And I couldn't find it. So I wrote it. That never to me was the plan to sort of enter my public writing, author life with a book on loss. But that's the way it happened for me. And then several years later, sort of when the dust settles in your crisis, what I was finding in my own life and in lots of people as was pastoring others and helping others was that when the dust would settle on your initial crisis, often I and others would find themselves in this sort of what I started calling the after crisis. Like the adrenaline's worn off, the immediate threat is gone, you've sort of settled somewhere on the other side. The world's moved on, you're not getting casseroles anymore. But
Right.
then like real life sets in and maybe it feels like people have moved on, but you're going, wow, that changed my whole life. It might have been one event or a series of events, or just a difficult season, but that period changed my life. And I feel like I am not who I used to be.
Mm.
And maybe I'm not who I'm yet going to be. And I'm in this weird kind of middle space where I don't have my bearings yet. And so for me, I guess I started seeing that once the crisis passed it doesn't mean that the crisis has passed, if that makes sense. Often people, will have some sort of identity crisis in their identity shift and spiritual shifting, perhaps a spiritual crisis. And so that's really where I wanted to focus in on with this next book. So I started writing it in 2020, and then the pandemic hit, and like we all have our stories about how the pandemic affected us. And for my
Yeah.
husband and I, we had been leading a ministry, a nonprofit, and it's not really relevant to the conversation at the moment, but like it for reasons beyond our control, directly related to the pandemic, we lost most of our whole team. And because they were all international, and so they all needed to go to their home nations, we lost most of our team. A lot of our ministry expression had to shift out of necessity, had the kids at home doing remote schooling, all the things.
Hmm.
Everyone was dealing with all the things. I'm not special, It was just a hard period for everyone.
But it was a crisis,
It was a
legitimately.
it
Yeah.
was another
Hmm.
crisis. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I started writing Tethered during that time. And I really, at the beginning, and we might get into this later, so I won't say too much, but at the beginning, I was really looking for like what keeps us tethered to hope? Like, how do I stay hopeful?
Mm.
How do people around us stay hopeful in this weird time? I was asking anyone I could, like, what's keeping you tethered to hope at the moment? Thinking like, collect little practices and I'll collect mindsets and this and that. For me, what I really realized over the course of writing this book was that it's not so much me staying tethered to hope, but it's actually God that tethers me to hope.
Mm.
That little paradigm shift was revolutionary for me personally, and because I had really struggled with the writing. So as I said, I started in 2020. My book was contracted years before, but then 2020 was so difficult, and then we ended up deciding not to rebuild the ministry, but to actually shift. Myriad of reasons, and I've written about some of them in the book, but the next few years were just huge, huge, huge shifts for us. We left full-time ministry, which my husband and I had both been doing for 22, 23 years, so that was huge. We ended up moving interstate, a lot of things were happening. I was hitting midlife, and somewhere in the mix, I realized, oh, I'm in perimenopause, and that's so fun. And,
Which is its
you know,
own crisis, right?
it's
As we
its
talk
own
about
thing.
those crises.
Absolutely. So, yeah, so there were just sort of these piling up things. So, even the writing of this book, I had to put it down and pick it up so many times. And what I thought was going to be, writing it over a year and spending another year through the editing, like it's already a long process to publish a book. Mm. But yeah, it ended up taking years because I threw it away so many times and started over, to be really honest. It was
Hmm.
a very frustrating. At one point I thought, I'm not the person to write this. Like I just can't. I can't do it. My life's too hard, and I can't pinpoint one thing and go, this is the reason why it was hard. But it was because I was in my own after crisis where
Yeah.
everything still felt shaky
Yeah.
and everything felt like it was shifting and I didn't quite have my bearings. And someone might go, you need to wait till you're really well and truly on the other side of that to be writing for
Mm.
others. And I think there's a wisdom in that. But I know that when I've been in my own tricky seasons, I actually want to hear from someone that's kind of not forgotten what it's
Yeah.
like. So I
Same.
did try to keep writing through the period so that I could write while it was actually fresh and I was experiencing it myself.
Again, you were writing the things that you needed to hear. You were writing this message for yourself in many ways, I'm sure, and practicing that for yourself in a way that authenticated this. This is true. These words are true, and they're trustworthy because I'm testing them out as I write. There were a couple of points where, as I was reading, I found myself, and maybe this is the writer in me that just has an eye for really beautiful, beautiful writing. And Adriel, you are a beautiful writer. Some of your sentences I just wanted to sit on and just like read and reread because they were poetically written and so profound. And I would find myself, if
Thank
I'm
you.
totally honest, you're welcome, yes, reading and thinking, because your message, your heart in this book is so similar to the message I hope to get out through permission slips and through my writing. in the world, which is this practice of self-compassion and receiving the kindness of God in quiet, unexpected ways. So much of this, I found myself reading your writing, listening to your voice through your words and thinking, I could never do this. I could never write this well. And then you would insert a vulnerable moment of saying, I didn't know if I could write this chapter, or I didn't know I didn't think I was qualified to keep leading, or I didn't think, even in your acknowledgments that I mentioned before we started recording, you said that you were in your own dark night of the soul as you were writing. And that vulnerability instantly made your words even more credible to me. And I thought, oh, I can relate to this person. She has something here that I want to hold on to because I can relate to that struggle. And so you talk about this idea of being tethered, not that we're holding on to a tether toward hope. We're not tethering ourselves to hope, but we are already tethered. Can you talk about what that means? Expand on that a little bit more, that idea of being tethered and how that became true for you, how you identified the reality of that in your own life.
I was just having this giant struggle with my writing, and I'm a writer. Like, I love to write. I love words. I do love to put together a great sentence. I love the craft of writing. And I it was unbelievable to me how hard it was for me to write during this period. Now, full disclosure, I was undiagnosed ADHD. I didn't know. And when I hit perimenopause, everything just sort of came out.
Hmm.
And I had felt like my brain stopped working. So I know now that it wasn't just that I was struggling with the message or the writing, it was actually my brain. It was just it was a brain thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand that at the time. I didn't know what was going on with me. I suspected it could be this or that, but I couldn't afford to go through the formal diagnosis process at the time, and so I was really struggling, and I was struggling with writing actual sentences. I was struggling with getting through a paragraph, things that had been really easy for me and come naturally for me before just all of a sudden felt so hard, and I couldn't understand what was going on with me. It was actually really scary. I didn't understand why my brain wasn't working and why I couldn't think clearly. And I had this day where, I had a deadline looming and I just could not make it through. And I was crying out of my own frustration and going, I know I have this message and me. Why am I struggling with the actual writing of it? And I like, at one point, just laid down on the floor, and I was like, "Maybe if I get desperate enough, God will meet me." Like, as if we can summon God with but anyway, I was laying on the floor and I was praying, like, laying face down, like, in the carpet, like, very unglamorous. I was praying and mostly just crying and feeling sorry for myself, but with the Lord.
Hmm.
And, and I just, remember going, I don't know how to write this. I don't know how to stay tethered to hope right now. I don't feel tethered to
Yeah.
hope. I feel really hopeless about my writing. I don't feel hopeless about my life, thankfully, or, my relationship, my connection with God, but I felt really hopeless about the writing. And I just felt like God, in whatever way God does, which is, sometimes can feel so hard to articulate, but I just feel like God put on my heart or somehow like let rest in my mind this really simple but profound phrase, Adriel, you don't have to stay tethered. You don't have to tether yourself to hope. I'm the tether. Like, I
Mm.
stay tethered to you. And that moment, it shifted things for me. It didn't mean that I sprung up from the floor and could like, "Woo, now I can write. Off we go to the races." Nothing like that. I still really struggled. My brain was still, you know, going through the same things it was. But I had this shift in me to realize that like no matter how I felt, I couldn't change the tether.
Hmm.
And that tether was going to remain even on the days where I felt really, really bad.
Hmm.
And I came to understand that because we're different every day, right? We're the same people and we're different people every day. So
Right.
some days I feel really brave. Some days I feel really resilient and strong and like I can do anything and I feel unstoppable, and other days I
Yeah.
feel really inadequate and I feel insecure or confused. And we all have those moments. It's really normal. That's the human experience, you know? But what this understanding of being tethered to hope has done for me is realize that no matter how I wake up feeling within myself and within my frame of mind, however my mental health is doing, it doesn't change the fact that we're tethered.
Mm,
And the best metaphor that I have come up with so far that I can give you is that the tether is like an umbilical cord. And
mm,
so, people might hear that word tether and have a negative connotation and think like, oh, a tether is something that sort of holds you back, holds a boat from drifting off to sea where it would have so much fun and, have adventures.
right.
But to me, tether, looking at a tether like an umbilical cord, is it's this connection. If you think of God as parent, as God as mother, and us as child, the umbilical cord is there whether the child is aware of it or not, whether the child doesn't do anything to earn it, doesn't do anything to strengthen it. It's just strong. It just is. And that umbilical cord, that tether is lifeblood for the
Mm,
child. But there's also there's a two-way thing that happens through the umbilical cord. So I'm not saying that we're removed for it or passive, but that it is initiated by God and it's
yeah.
strong because of who God is as our mother and who God
Mm,
is as our parent. And so that's the best way that I can describe what it means to be tethered to hope is that tether, and unlike, an umbilical cord, it doesn't just get severed at some point.
right. Right.
But it's to know that we go through our lives being tethered to God to me is a tremendous comfort.
Yeah. When I just I feel the pressure release as you say
Yeah.
that we're already tethered. It's not initiated by me, it's initiated by God. And even as you say, God is mother, like that for some people could feel stretching, right? Like that's a paradigm or a metaphor, a way of thinking about God that may be less familiar to people depending on their faith background
Hmm.
or where they're at in their spiritual journey. That could be
Yeah.
helpful or stretching.
Yeah. Well, I actually had a whole chapter in Tethered to Hope on God as our mother, because I think it's really important when we're in these tricky seasons, one of the things that's really helped me is to examine my metaphors. Like, what are the
Mm,
metaphors that are going to help me in this season? So, one of my
mm,
metaphors that helped me was this umbilical cord metaphor.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And another one is just looking at God as my mother. And God's
mm,
not gendered, so this is not about gender, but this is about, the heart of God, and that
yeah.
God, in God's mysterious ways, encompasses a father heart and a mother heart both, and that's a
Mm,
beautiful thing. We ended up taking that chapter out because my book was too long, and so we took out 3 chapters that sort of could go together in another book or in the future if needed. But I did modify that, and I wrote quite a long essay on my Substack if people wanna read about the mother heart of God. I have published that because I decided I didn't wanna wait for another book. Who knows if
mm.
I'll publish another book, so it's there.
Okay, so check out the Foundry on Substack.
Mm,
Look for Adriel's. I'll link that in the show notes too, so people can find that article
sounds
if
good.
they
Yeah.
want to find it. But I love that how honest you are in this book about the metaphors maybe that you're examining, or even the seasons of doubt or deconstruction, the places where whether it was because of a crisis or something else, you were examining your expectations of how God would show up and you were really stretching your understanding of what faith looked like for you in seasons where things got dark. And I'm thinking about specifically the seasons of doubt and deconstruction that you were very honest about, which a lot of people might hear that word and feel a way about it. It's a word that's often used in a negative way in Christian context, although I think that there's a lot of unnecessary fear around it. Um, so what would you say to someone who is in their own season of doubt or deconstruction or trying to figure out what is the metaphor for my journey with God that is most accurate? Or what are the metaphors that have kept me in a box that don't feel true anymore as people are wrestling? And that was another metaphor, a story from scripture that you shared around Jacob wrestling with God, which that wrestle is a metaphor I really resonate with right now personally. What would you say to someone who's in their own place of whether it's doubt or deconstruction and wrestling? What would you want them to know?
Well, I think actually it is important for you to find your metaphor. So I love that you have latched onto that wrestling metaphor. Um, and that's part of the reason why I used different metaphors in the book. I didn't just go with one and go, this is it, this is the one we're going to explore.
Uh,
But I tried to introduce several to go like find your language because that's for us, that's part of what's so important to be able to, you know, name our own scenario, our own emotions, our own experience. But sometimes we need some prompts to help us find the language. So I think finding your metaphor is really important. You know, Christians and humans in general have been pulling apart their faith and putting it back together for as long as we know, as long as history is actually recorded. So I know that deconstruction can sound like it's a buzzword, we've adopted it in the last, 10 years or something, but it's not 10 years old. I don't even love the term deconstructing. I'll use it sometimes because people know what it means, but for me, I don't really identify so much with my faith, in building terms. So to me, deconstructing isn't great. I know for others it can be. I did hear someone, I feel like it might have been Shannon Martin, but apologies if I'm attributing someone else's metaphor to the wrong person. But I remember reading years ago about someone describing their flower vase. And when you've bought fresh cut flowers or you've picked them from the garden, like they die at different intervals. And if you're lazy, you just go pitch the whole thing out once a few of them
mm,
start dying. But if you're like me, and well, not saying I'm not lazy, I can be, but if you're like me, you want to just squeeze every little bit of goodness out of those flowers. And so I'm constantly taking them out and I rearrange the whole thing because it doesn't look right with, I love a flower arrangement. So, and I think of I love that metaphor for deconstructing because it's going, well, what's not working for me right now? What do I not understand in this season? Maybe it made sense before, but it doesn't anymore. I'm going to take that out for a bit because I don't want that to taint what I've got
mm,
left. And then
mm,
sometimes we go out to the garden and I'm expanding on the metaphor now. Sometimes it's not just about what we take out, but we go out to the garden and we go, oh, that left a spot, but I'm going to go find something else. I'm going to put a
mm,
branch because I don't have any flowers, but I'm going to go put a little branch in there. I'm going to put, something else. And we're rearranging. And I think, what I would say to someone that's in that phase right now of maybe taking some stuff out is to go, you don't just have to go tip the whole thing out. You can take out what's not working. And sometimes we put those things back in and sometimes we find something better. And actually to me that shows that your faith is not stagnant. It's not um yeah, it's not just what's been packaged up and handed to you from another generation or another experience, but actually it's your own. It's part of what makes
mm,
your faith feel personal while
mm.
it's still part of that collective story that we all belong to. So in saying that, it can feel very, very disconcerting when you're in the middle of pulling things apart. It can feel lonely. It can feel scary. It can feel any number of things. So I am not diminishing sort of the negative aspects of how it can feel, but to say that one, it's normal. Two, you don't have to throw everything out. You can actually make something more beautiful. I've had a few seasons or periods in my life where would say I've deconstructed a bit. And this recent one isn't one of them. I wasn't deconstructing during this last years that were difficult. I'd already had a few times of deconstructing, reconstructing, rearranging, all of that. But I know that often after a crisis is when people deconstruct,
Mm,
which is why I wanted
mm.
to write about that in the book because that is
Yeah.
often a trigger, to kind of set things in
Mhm,
motion. And I think as hard as it is, I think that's a kind trigger. Not saying that crisis is kind or your loss or your job loss or your divorce or your diagnosis, those things aren't kind. So that's not what I'm saying. But I think one of the kind things that can come out of it is the forced opportunity to actually examine what was holding
mhm.
me back, what beliefs have I just adopted without really considering who is God really to me in this season and who is God for all time and not
Well, I
just
love
according to my culture or my tradition or. my family.
Right. And I love that you're acknowledging that a crisis can spur on some of these hard questions that are actually really healthy for us to ask about our expectations, about who we are, about what is keeping us tethered, who or what we're tethered to. There are so many things that a crisis can stir up in us that feel really uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean they're bad or wrong. And I would love for you to talk about what you mean by crisis anyway, because as I was reading the book in the beginning, I thought, well, I don't really relate to being in a crisis. I don't feel like I'm in a crisis. I'm not in some sort of medical diagnosis or treatment. I'm not, there's nothing abrupt that has happened to me or my family that feels really overwhelming, but I am in what you call a liminal space, one of those in between moments of things were like this and now that's not working. And I'm in this kind of middle ground before I know how things are going to play out. And I'm specifically thinking about my business and ministry and kind of this identity crisis I feel like I'm in the midst of what are you calling me to, God? Because how things were working before was beautiful and I understood what to do and I understood who I was and how to expect you to show up. And that's not working anymore. And so who am I? Who am I and what are you asking me to do next? And do I even want to? Do I even want to keep going? And that feels like the crisis, that the internal angst that I feel feels like the crisis. But there's nothing on the outside that anyone would look at me and think, oh, that happened. How is she doing? Nothing has happened. And so I'm wondering if you could expand on what you mean by crisis and then what that liminal space can look or feel like in different people's experience.
Of course, I think the easiest or the most succinct way to answer that would be that change is crisis.
Ugh,
Change is crisis,
yes. It's
right? And
terrible
I
and
think,
true.
and
Uh-huh.
so, for some people, we go, we love change, like we thrive on change. Other people are like, I hate change, So there's this whole spectrum of how we approach change. But the reality is change changes things. And so we hit these times in our lives. So it might be that, the a really common one for people is the change from pre-parenthood to parenthood.
Hmm.
That's a crisis. And
Yeah.
see, we often think, oh, crisis is a wildfire or it's
Mm-hmm.
a natural disaster or it's a catastrophic diagnosis or whatever. And those things are crises for sure. But a crisis can also just mean a major shift from one state of being to another state of being. So perimenopause, hello, that's a crisis. It doesn't mean that
Absolutely.
that I'm living every day in, like a horrible moment. It's not an event. So I think it's important to say that a crisis doesn't have to be an event, but it can be I don't know, season is so overused in Christian circles, but I don't know what else to say, like a period,
Mm-hmm.
a season of time, a chapter of time. Yeah, I think that when I was looking up this word crisis, and I did a bit of a word nerd study on it, and I found that this word was actually first used in the medical community. And in English, it was first used in the medical community. And crisis meant the point in a disease where things shifted. And they either shifted toward healing and that person was going to be okay, or they shifted toward decline and that person was likely going to die. So it was sort of a crossroads, a pivotal
Yeah.
moment. And I know that when we hit our own crisis in our life, now we use crisis, usually for like, I lost my job you know, I lost my baby or whatever the thing that we can easily identify. But crisis can also be, I hit this period in my life, as you're talking about, my work is shifting, my life is shifting, and I don't know the way forward. So you're at a crossroads. That
Uh-huh.
is a crisis. And we get to determine in that space, as Christians, we get to include God and determine in that space, which way am I going to pivot? And we're always looking for the pivot toward life, not the pivot toward decline. And
Yeah.
that's true whether you're a Christian or not. So I'm not speaking specifically to Christians, but I think it can be helpful to look at crisis as a turning point. I use the word liminal space because liminal means in between. Sort of it means threshold. If you think of a door, if you think of a threshold to a home, that's you cross over the threshold, or we have this, funny tradition that like maybe a groom carries their bride over the threshold. And I don't know what that means, but whatever. No, but that we probably don't use the word threshold a lot in our everyday language. And we can maybe think of it as like just a very clear point, like a door. You're on one side and you step over, you're on the other side. But a liminal space is a threshold, but it's not like just a one step, two step. You don't just sort of cross over. It's more like the metaphor that works for me is it's like an airport. So say
Mm,
you're going somewhere and you've got 2 legs or 3 legs of your flight and you've got layovers in between. You're in an airport. So that airport, it's its own space,
hmm
but it's not where you live and it's not where you're going to be living or holidaying or whatever. Like it's in between. It's neither here nor there, but it's still its own distinct space.
Yeah.
And when you're on layover, you are generally not enjoying that space. It's like
Let's
feels
just get
like
to the
that,
place.
like
Yeah.
necessary evil to just get to the place.
hmm
That's what and I think that is how we feel when we're in liminal spaces, when we're like, this does not feel like where I've come from. This doesn't feel like where I want to be. But I am in this place right now
Yeah.
that has its own sort of thing. And you see liminal spaces through scripture. I've written about several of them in the book. But liminal spaces are these seasons where we feel like things are ambiguous, they're confusing. We feel like we're kind of in between, not who we used to be, not who we're going to be, neither here nor there. They can feel difficult, but they're not always clear, as in, I've been here, I'm going there, or I'm stepping over. Often the edges are fuzzy. Sometimes the beginning edge can feel sharp. We're
hmm
thrust into it through one of those easily identifiable crises.
Yeah.
But like you're feeling now in this season of change in your own life, I suspect that entry was fuzzy. The border was
hmm
fuzzy. And probably
Yeah.
as you exit out, the border will be fuzzy too. I remember sort of getting to the end of writing my book and thinking, I think I'm actually maybe out of my own liminal space, but I don't really know yet. It's kind of felt early to name it because it's
hmm
fuzzy, you know. But
Yeah. There's a
eventually,
gradual.
yeah,
hmm
eventually you're on the other side of it going, oh, I feel my bearings again. Oh, I feel a
Yeah.
sense of myself again. I feel like I can articulate, what that was and where I
Mm,
am now. And some of those things feel really hard. So when you're in that liminal space, I think it's helpful to actually name it as a space, that it's not just in between. Like
yeah.
the in between is its own space with its own characteristics, its
Yeah.
own possibilities of meeting God in different ways that weren't possible, literally weren't possible before, and they become possible. So you think of
Well, this
Jesus
book.
in the wilderness, right? Like that
Yeah.
was a liminal space. And the ways that he had to confront his demons and was able to commune with God. I mean, we don't know a lot about that those days he was out there, but it was its own thing. And
Yeah.
he wasn't able to have those experiences before or after. He needed to be in that liminal space in order to do
Yeah.
what he did. And there's lots more
Right.
examples too.
Which this book really is for people that find themselves in one type of liminal space or another. And you do such a beautiful job of giving dozens and dozens of examples of what those liminal spaces could be. But I love that picture of crisis as a crossroads
Mm,
or an invitation toward life, that turning point toward life and away from death. I love, can I read just a little bit from the beginning of your book,
of course.
where you talk about crises aren't just events that happen to us. They are catalysts, turning points that happen around and within us. And we need so badly to know God is still with us as we enter into these liminal spaces of turning and transition and change and possibly even transformation and grow into a new version of ourselves. There is worth to be found in the middle, but we have to pause long enough to absorb what the middle actually is, put some language around it, locate ourselves within it, and orient ourselves to its disposition and ambition. It's beautiful. So you really do an incredible job, Adriel, of helping people put language around the middle space, using metaphors, using your own examples and stories which there is something really helpful about putting language around our experience as a life and leadership coach. That's what I do, is help people make sense of and name their current reality so that we can move toward our desired future. But we don't know where we're going. If we don't know how to get to where we want to go unless we know where we are. And
100%.
so I love the way you do that. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, but I'm wondering, for anyone that finds themselves in a liminal space today, what practices, and you have so many beautiful ones in the book. So maybe what one practice would you offer them as an invitation to meet God in the midst of that liminal space, or to help put words around or find their bearings in the midst of that middle ground?
One practice. I mean, I think the most important thing, and this isn't a practice as in, prayer or taking walks or like that type of a practice. It's more of a mindset, practicing a mindset. And I think I would start with practicing the mindset that you're already tethered, because we just so often feel like we're not. We often feel like hope is thin, or hope has disappeared, or hope is fleeting because we have it one day and don't have it the next, equate it with an
Mm-hmm.
emotion. And it,
Yeah.
it is an emotion. It can feel like an emotion, but it's more than
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah.
And so I would say start with that, the practice of actually practicing the mindset of I'm already tethered.
Yeah.
And then I know you asked for one, but I think there's sort of a succession. So it's practicing the mindset that you're already tethered. And then it's in that space of beginning to adopt and learn and believe that you're tethered, to then also go, I need to like put language on what I'm going through.
Mm.
And if you need to read a book to help you get some language, do that. If you need to journal to help you get some language, do that. If you need to pray to help you get some language, or speak with a friend or a counselor, a coach, whatever, but get some language. And so to me, that's a really, really important practice. And
Mm-hmm.
it's harder to do the other things, the more physical practices
Mm.
that can help move those truths into our bodies, unless we're starting with, actually looking at our mindsets and where we get stuck. So
Yeah.
that's sort of
Yeah.
where I would like to start and suggest that people start.
Love that invitation. Just again, as another resource, toward the very end of your book, you have a lengthy list of questions to help process and reflect and make sense of what your experience actually is. And you warned me not to skip the reader. You warned the reader not to skip over that chapter. And I really wanted to, because I had an interview to get ready for, Adriel, and I needed to make sure I could finish the book. But I'm so glad you said, take the time to reflect. And again, through tears, slowing down enough to pay attention and put language, even for myself and with God. I spent some time talking to God about things that I hadn't been willing to name.
Wow.
And because you gave me that permission to name the things out loud, the disappointments, the expectations that weren't being met, I was allowed in that moment to experience the kindness of God, not through any audible voice or anything changing, but I was able to notice his witness in that moment because I was willing to name my honest, real experience. So
So good.
thank you for this
So good.
resource. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that too. That means a lot to
Yes.
hear. That's
Yes.
exactly what I hope. You write with the intention, as a Christian writer, I write with the intention that I could open a door for people to meet God
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
fresh way, because
Mm,
we all need that. I need people to open
yeah.
the door for me, and you need people to
Yeah.
open the door for you. And that really is what I hope Tethered to Hope will do
Mm,
for people, is just open the door to see God's kindness in the ways that they need to when we're struggling.
yeah. Thank you for that gift. Is
Yeah.
there a permission slip that you would want to give to the people listening?
Something that a permission slip that I've given myself and that I continue to issue as I need it, which is all the time, is permission to practice self-compassion, which I find very, very difficult. It's
Hmm.
easy and natural for me to feel compassionate toward other people. And, I could go into all the ways and the baggage for why it feels difficult to be compassionate toward myself. And I don't need to, because I'm sure that there's lots of people listening that would struggle with this too. But I think, yeah, the permission slip to learn what it means to be self-compassionate as more than just a self-help thing, more than just a buzzy thing, but actually genuine self-compassion that comes from the heart of God, who describes himself as compassionate.
Mhm.
God, like, yeah, there's a whole sermon there, but God is compassionate. That is
Yeah.
one of the first ways God describes himself. And that is who God is, and therefore who we are in light of God's presence. And so
Yeah.
you have permission to explore that. It's not a woo woo thing, it's not just a
Mm.
psychology thing, although
Mhm.
there's the science to back it up too, but it is theological and it is very, very practical. So explore self compassion, apply self compassion, give yourself permission to have compassion toward
Mhm.
yourself because you need it.
Absolutely. And I think you and I could talk for another 3 hours about the beauty and necessary spiritual practice of self-compassion. But I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah,
Adriel, thank you for being here. This has been such a gift to me.
I'm so glad. It's been a gift to me too. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Permission Slips. I hope this conversation gave you permission to consider where in your life you might be in one of those liminal spaces, a threshold as you step into something new, whether it feels like a crisis or a more gradual change based on external circumstances or something within. And I hope as you start to notice and name some of those external or internal realities that you'll be able to see that God has you already tethered. You don't have to do a thing. So get your copy of Tethered to Hope. The link is in the show notes. If you're looking for a tool to help you reflect and practice self-compassion, I've got a free resource that I'll link in the show notes called The Gentle Framework that gives you questions and prompts to help you practice paying attention to your life with self-compassion and gentleness. Remember, your life matters, and so do the crises or the liminal spaces that shape you and change you more than you know.